This is the $16,000 Canon C500 Mark II, and it has been my primary camera for nearly all of my projects this last year. I've used it on everything from music videos to short films and commercials, and while I've really come to adore this camera, I have discovered some quirks that are worth mentioning. Let's start with the Canon's RAW capabilities. At its best, the C500 Mark II can shoot at 5.9K 12-bit RAW using their Cinema Raw Lite codec. This codec gives you the full power of the camera's video capabilities, but it has a couple of drawbacks. First, the files are massive. On a single 512GB CFast Express card, you can shoot for a total of 32 minutes in RAW. In comparison, if you're shooting using the XF AVC file type, you can shoot for a total of 166 minutes. That's like 5 times as long. So while having the RAW capabilities is nice, I have found myself shooting with it less just because I don't want to have to deal with the file storage. Now with the R5C, they actually give you 3 different options of RAW compression: the light, standard, and high quality RAW. And actually it's the same with the C70, which is what Dave is shooting on right now. These compressions are something that could almost certainly be implemented into the C500 via a firmware update, and I'm not really sure why Canon hasn't offered this yet. This is something I've actually reached out to them about specifically. I talked to them about this at NAB.
No thanks.
And I'm honestly a little disappointed that it's not available, because I would love to be shooting RAW more often and getting the 6K capabilities of this camera. This is something that I actually appreciate about Blackmagic's line of cameras. When they come out with a new color science for, say, their Ursa Mini Pro 12K, they offer that color science as a firmware update for their lower end cameras. Canon seems to be doing this a bit backwards, so I hope that's something that they change. I've also noticed that the RAW codec on the 500 Mark II can be pretty noisy, and I guess that makes sense considering the codec is RAW, straight from the camera sensor, but when shooting in their XF AVC compression, the video is incredibly clean, which is really, really great, and often I find myself just shooting in XF AVC because I just have a clean image right out the gate, and I don't have to worry about cleaning it up in post or whatever. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about the XF AVC codec. As of now, the C500 can only shoot in 10-bit 422 at a 4K resolution, reserving the 6K exclusively for their RAW codec. Again, I'm not really sure why Canon did it this way. Certainly if the camera can handle a 6K RAW file, then surely it can handle 6K 10-bit log footage. But
I don't know.
when shooting in the XF AVC format, however, the camera's low light capabilities are impressive. I recently shot a piece using the Laowa probe lens, which when wide open shoots at an f14. So as you can imagine, you either need a lot of light or you need to shoot at a higher ISO. For this piece, I was shooting mostly at 3200 in a low lit garage, but sometimes I even had to crank that to 6400. And the thing that I was so impressed with was the low levels of noise that I saw when I was looking at these images in post. As with many cameras, they say to expose to the right, meaning to overexpose your image as bright as you can without clipping, because it's always easier to darken an image in post to clean up the noise than it is to brighten an image that was underexposed, which will almost always introduce more noise to your image. Now with most cameras, there's usually a limit to this. Increase your ISO too much and no amount of darkening will eliminate all the noise that you've introduced. However, with the C500, I was shocked with how clean the image was, even when shooting at 6400. Again, I wish Canon offered that 6K resolution to this codec, because as the resolution goes up, the noise in your frame gets smaller and less noticeable, making the camera's low light capabilities even greater. Moving on to slow and fast mode, which is what Canon uses to refer to their different frame rates for under and over cranking. The C500 can shoot in a variety of different frame rates, starting on the low end of 12 frames per second and on the high end 120 frames per second. You can shoot up to 60 frames per second using the full scale of the camera sensor, but the big bummer comes in when shooting at 120 frames per second, which is only available in a cropped sensor mode, and not at a Super 35 crop, but rather at a Super 16 crop. This is a massive bummer because cropping in that much basically makes the footage unusable. The camera's noise gets amplified, the sharpness is significantly reduced, and the overall image just kind of looks crummy. When shooting in slow and fast mode, you also lose both autofocus functionality and audio recording. I've never been personally affected by this too much, but it is worth noting. The field of view on your monitor also shrinks quite a bit if you're using the anamorphic desqueeze mode on the camera. So your 4.3-inch monitor, which is already pretty tiny, becomes more like a 3-inch monitor when shooting in slow motion anamorphic. This would obviously be an easy fix by getting some sort of external monitor like the Small HD 703 or something similar, but considering I've gotten along just fine in most cases using the kit monitor, it would be nice to just use the full field of view whether you're shooting in normal frame rates or slow-mo. On a personal note, I wish that the cameras offered better under-cranking frame rates. I personally don't shoot a ton of stuff in the high frame rate world, but I love to shoot at lower frame rates. I just think that there's so much creative content that you can get using this technique, and it's massively overlooked. I think the only cameras that offer really great great low frame rate options are red, which can go down to a single frame per second. Again, I'm not really sure why lower frame rates aren't offered in many cameras, but I'm probably the fringe filmmaker here, so. The digital image stabilization is a pretty cool function to offer, especially for a cinema camera. You typically find this sort of feature on the lower end mirrorless or DSLR cameras, so seeing it in a cinema camera is pretty neat. Having said that, I have gotten myself into some trouble by using this function. Because it's digital IS and not IBIS or in-body image stabilization, the camera tries its best to stabilize footage the same way that your NLE would. So people or objects moving in the frame can actually throw off the tracking and warp the image as it tries to stabilize. Whereas in IBIS, the sensor itself is stabilized using springs and motors to counter the camera's physical movements. So you get a true stabilized image. I have found some moderate success using the digital IS with the C500 when shooting wide or establishing shots, but I typically recommend that people just do the image stabilizing in post, because once you've shot using the digital IS, it is burned into your footage and there's no fixing any weird warps or things that might happen while on set. So now I've spent a lot of time talking about the different quirks that I've discovered while shooting this past year on my C500, but the thing I really want to drive home is how incredibly happy that I am with this camera. The more I shoot with it, the more impressed I've become. The way that this camera renders colors, the dynamic range, the skin tones, the ergonomic build, the full frame sensor, all of it has been so incredibly impressive. Quirks and imperfections aside, I love this camera. It has been the perfect tool for the projects that I personally work on. And Canon, if you're listening, I really hope that you'll fix some of these functions. It would really make a big difference, and also make it a little cheaper. That would be nice. If you like this video, check out our ultimate Canon comparison video where you can see how the C500 stacks up against other Canon cameras, and we definitively prove that the C500 is better than the C70. Yes, it is, Dave. It is better. This is my video, butt out me. I'm the director.